Hello, welcome to the Writing Gals podcast. Tonight we're talking about dialogue, which is my absolute favorite thing to talk about. And I can't wait to delve into this. But before we do, we're going to touch base with everybody on how they're, doing with their new launches and their writing projects. So let's turn it over to Judy.
Okay. So I am like 7 chapters into my young adult romance, My Second Chance, which is the 4th book in my Ridgewater High series. I've been doing that one for a couple months now, but it's slowly moving forward. I write and then I edit as I go, and it seems like I've been stuck on the last 2 chapters for this whole week, but I think I finally got them done. So yeah, I'm hoping to have it finished within the next 30 days because I really have to if I'm going to get it ready for my pre-order that I set up and then write my next book that's scheduled to come out at a certain date that I have to meet. So yeah, that's me.
Deadlines are super fun. I've been under a few myself lately. How about you, Amy? You've been rocking it, so tell us about what you got going on.
Well, I have the Marrying a Prince is done and released, and it has done really well, has stayed pretty sticky, pretty high, which I've been really excited about. It kind of went high and then went low a little bit and then went high and kind of stayed really high for a while and is now slowly starting to come back down. And then my first YA book is out, and it has been released, and it's kind of followed that same pattern. It went high and then went low a little bit, and then it went high and then even higher, and it's kind of stayed in about number 500 to 600 all on its own. So I'm pretty excited about that. It kind of makes me feel happy that I can write in both genres and do well, that my readers accept both of them. Although some of my reviews were like, I really like that she's writing YA because it seems like a better fit for her. And I was like, oh, okay, sounds good. I think it's the difference between first and third person. I really enjoy first person. And then I have my second book because I'm rapidly releasing them. So my second book's going to release next Wednesday. And then my third book should release in September. I'm hoping earlier than what I have set my pre-order for, but
Well,
Did she disappear for you?
yeah, she did. We lost Amy for a minute. We got a black square. Hopefully she'll be back.
Yeah. Messenger just in case she didn't notice that she disappeared.
Yeah, get on that because I'm talking. We also are missing Victorine tonight. She was planning to be with us, but her family ended up being on the road still between hotels, and so she's not able to be on here with us tonight either. And looks like she's trying to come back. There she is.
That was weird. My computer decided to be like, and you're done talking. So I'm going to shush you now. So in a really fast way to talk, it's coming out next week, and then I'm writing the third book currently. So lots of stuff going on.
So cool. It's so fun watching Amy's books and Judy's books rise and do so awesome, and then it makes me think, I need to get books out. But I finally got one out this week. So my mermaid book, The Lovely Deep, is live, and I'm kind of joking with myself. I'm definitely doing the slow launch thing with this one. So it's starting to rise a little bit. We'll see how it goes tomorrow when I drop the price a little bit and have a few promotion, like newsletters and things go out. But my Regency novella, The Unwanted Suitor, is also up for pre-order and due to come out September 4th. So that's super exciting. And I get to write tomorrow, which is the best because it's been a long time since I've been able to just sit and write new words. And so I'm really excited to delve into that tomorrow. Let's see here. We are going to just talk about the Midwest Conference really quick because it's only 35 days away, which I'm excited about because these gals are my best friends and we live in different places. Like we're just scattered all over the place. And so it's so exciting when we get to be together. And we hope all of you will come and join us and meet us. It's a great conference. So that's called the SMEA, or Storymakers Indie Author Hub Midwest Conference. It's in Kansas City, and it is at the Plaza Embassy Suites there in Kansas City, Missouri. And it is on the 20th, if you're going to boot camp, of September, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So we hope that you will all try and come out there to see our classes, because we're all teaching too. Oh, except Judy, but she's,
Sorry. Maybe some other time I'll make it.
We're hoping, but we'll see her at other conferences. And we're, like we said, we've talked about, we have something really exciting to announce in April as soon as Victorine has more details on that. Okay, let's talk about dialogue, shall we? I'm gonna just try not to be too giddy all night long talking about my favorite thing. Okay, let's talk about, one of the things I think is interesting about dialogue is it has so many jobs in a story. Like, you just think it's people talking, but it does a lot of jobs. So you guys want to tell us some of the things you can use dialogue to accomplish in a story? You want me to just talk first?
Oh, I was trying to.
Okay.
Well, you can like give like subtext in a way, like have your readers saying one thing but really meaning another, which is a lot of fun to play with. Yeah. I don't have a ton of. I'm not the dialogue expert here, so.
Yeah. No, I think subtext is awesome, and one of my favorite quotes, and I'm a terrible person because I don't know who said it, is that the best dialogue is oh gosh, it was right there on the tip of my tongue, is what people aren't saying, right? And that's what subtext is all about. Amy, you have anything you want to add?
Well, you can use dialogue to break up big scenes, chunks of backstory. 35 days away from teaching my class, and I haven't even started getting ready for it. So now I'm kind of coming up with things to write about or talk about. Well, one of them is backstory and how to weave it in. And a lot of times you can do backstory and dialogue. You just have to be careful where you don't have it like where you go, as you know, blah, 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 blah. And the person's like, the reader's like, well, you're just putting that in there to tell the reader what's going on, because you wouldn't ever in a conversation like talk about the past in that sort of way. So you got to be careful, but you can weave in backstory, you can weave in physical characteristics. Dialogue can do a lot, and I think dialogue is a action moving way to describe something instead of just blocks of text where you're like, thinking of the past. Dialogue is really a fast way to get things moving, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's great for pacing and characterization, like you talked about. You can use it for foreshadowing. You can use it to support your theme if you've got something that you're really wanting to, kind of highlight without people coming straight out and saying it, but people can kind of like ask questions or refer to things that make the people think. I think dialogue is underappreciated. Most people just get kind of afraid of it, and they know it's hard a lot of the times, but I think sometimes it's a missed opportunity. So
well, on the other side of that, people think it's really easy, and it's not. It's hard because you can't just say, when I first started writing, I used to write like do not or was not, and a lot of people don't do that. You smush all those things together. It's important to keep your dialogue natural, and I think a lot of times we don't when we're writing it. So some people think it's easy, and I think on the other hand, it's actually pretty difficult to write really, really well and really snappy and really, grabbing the reader's attention. Oh, Michelle, you're muted.
I know. I had to turn off my notifications on one of my message groups. My Regency gals are having a good time tonight. Okay, so yeah, I think let's go right into one of the other questions, because it kind of is all about this. Like, how do you make dialogue feel natural and without being actually realistic. You know, it's a really tricky thing. Somebody on our Facebook group asked, how do you decide how many filler words to use, like or 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 those kinds of things that we all kind of say in real life. And that's what's really tricky about dialogue, is that you want it to sound realistic. You want the reader to feel like, yeah, this character would really say this thing. But you don't actually want to write real dialogue, because real dialogue is awful. It just terrible. And we do have a lot of filler words, because we have to, like I'm talking right now, we have to stop and think about every word. We stumble. We have all kinds of just messiness, because we don't get to edit our dialogue when it's actually real life dialogue. We don't get to fix it. We just have to say it. And I'm always teasing people, I talk a lot better with a keyboard than I do with my mouth. And so when we're writing dialogue, we have the opportunity to go back and fix it. And I think that's great too, because you know how when you're out somewhere and somebody's like rude to you at the grocery store, and then you're just kind of like, okay. And then in the car, you're like, man, I wish I'd said this, and you have this like perfect comeback. And when you're editing or writing, you can put all that awesome sauce into your dialogue, because you have the luxury of editing. And so that's one of the things that I just adore about writing dialogue. Um, so how do you make your, because sometimes we do like to put in those like and things like that. So do you guys, feel like you are pretty good at working those filler words, and somebody asked about them specifically?
Well, I think for me, I do those at the first as the start of my sentence. So blah 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 blah, or yeah, I say yeah a lot when I'm typing, or and so I think for me, catching those is helpful to listen to it like through your Kindle Talk to You on your computer, because they always say it so terribly. And so then the more they say it, the more I catch it, and the more I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to delete some of those because they sound so bad, because it's always like, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I need to delete it. So that's helpful for me. I think because when I'm in the throes of writing, I don't really notice it. Or I just think I kind of play out the scene in my mind, and that's what they would do. That's what people would do. I save the ums and the does and stuff for very, very specific purposes. Like if they're trying, like if I'm trying to show that they're like stuttering in their brain and they can't get what they want to out, that's when I reserve for that. But I wouldn't write it naturally. I think it would be very annoying to read it if it was all the time.
Yeah. You want to use it for when they're like really nervous around the boy they like or whatever, specific reasons.
Highlight something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think on top of that too, though, it's important to, I was listening to a podcast, I think by Brandon Sanderson, I can't remember, but they were talking about how do you write dialogue when it comes to accents or things like that. And I think it gets really difficult to do that because it's hard to read it like visually. But as I was at a class and they were talking about how in Huckleberry Finn, he speaks in very broken English, but he does it so well that it's hard to notice it. Is that, you're nodding, like, am I right?
Yeah, definitely. Mark Twain was a master at, colloquial language, and not many people can replicate it. It's kind of like, unless you're Mark Twain, you might not want to try it too much. It can get so burdensome and draw a reader out of a story. One thing that I've seen is that you should just put in just like a little bit of an accent when you first introduce that character, and maybe have like one word or two words that he just kind of says all the time, but not try and make every single word that he says or every single sentence super rich with accents and funny spellings. You just want just a hint, and every now and then you just want to remind the reader this guy has an accent, because there have been other times when somebody mentions in a book that a character has like a Scottish accent, and I'm like, where did that come from? you know, or it's there in the beginning and then the rest of the story there's nothing. You have to put just like little dribbles or sprinkles of it all the way through to keep reminding the reader that that accent is there. And you know, it is really tricky. And that, like I said, I think the most important thing to writing good dialogue is editing. And hearing back from beta readers and editors, you know, what they thought about how well you did. And sometimes that's the only way to measure whether or not you're doing okay with it. So I'm glad you brought up the accents because somebody else was asking about the accents.
Well, you said yourself in a couple episodes ago where your girl started out as Southern and sassy, and as the book continued on, she lost her sass and her Southernness.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
have to say, as somebody who lives in the North, it's very hard to, I try to write Southern, but I am not good at it at all. So I think in ways you kind of need to probably stick to what you know because it comes out more naturally instead of force, like I think it would be if I tried to write Southern.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah. Especially if you don't know it really well, it is good to do it like as sparingly as possible. I do think Southern accents are often underrepresented in fiction a little bit, so that's why I like to really put a lot of Southern characters in. But you know, when I go up north to visit family or something, there is a definite difference in how people speak in the north too. And it's sometimes hard to put your finger on that. So a good part of dialogue is just opening up your ears and listening, you know, picking up on little things that, you know, make the difference. A lot of times, you know, in this country, in the United States, you can hear, you know, pick out things and tell almost immediately where that person was from. And you can do that in almost every country, you know, that there is you can pick out a geographical location within a country or within a language where that person came from. And so it's really interesting to try and use that for your characterization. If you can just do it, you know, just the right amount. It's kind of like um, pepper is a good thing, but you don't want to over pepper it. Um, so let's talk about how you make character voices distinct from one another.
So one, like some things you can do is because we all have like different pet words that we will say. Like I like to say definitely a lot, or I don't it did this like crazy. And so you can't have all your characters saying those words. Just to keep it distinct, have, you know, this character likes to say this word. Don't have them say it like all the time, but you know that that's that character speaking without the dialogue tag because they said it that way. And then just a way that I keep them different. I just try to imagine different people in my life that have the kind of similar personalities to my characters, and I just imagine their voice in my head as I'm writing it. Like, how would this person say it? And that tends to help me a lot. So
I think for me, it's also understanding what your character's motivations are and keeping that in the forefront of your mind as you're writing the dialogue. One of my favorite tropes is enemies to lovers. And I think it's because when you write the dialogue between the two of them, it's very snappy and they're very sarcastic with each other. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that my husband is exactly like that, which is why I love the trope, because I love witty banter between two people. And I love it when they sort of insult each other, but it sounds like it's a good thing. But then, you know, they each have the things that the moral ground that they're going to stand on, and they're not going to let go of that ground. And so it always comes back to them kind of insulting each other against what they feel is right or how they, you know, portray, and then they kind of poke each other at that. And that, I think, is knowing your character and knowing what they value and the things that they see, and then allowing the other person to kind of tease and make fun of them because of those, you know, morals. And so like in my Finding Love with a Billionaire, which is my enemies to lover stranded trope, she's a journalist and he's a billionaire, and she's kind of high and mighty about herself, and he's always, at one point, he keeps calling her a reporter, and she's like trying to say, I'm a journalist, and like she's muttering it under her breath. So it's like those types of things that you can really show an attraction in a dialogue. You can really show frustration in dialogue. And I think that's one of my favorite, that I think my dialogue really shines when it comes to the enemies to lover trope, because I love it when they just are so mean to each other, but you can tell that they like each other at the same time. It's just really fun.
Yeah, I think personalities are really important, right? And so it's always good. You can't really write good dialogue that's, makes every voice within your story distinct if you don't have a feeling for who each of them are individually. And sometimes it doesn't happen until you're partway through the story and you start figuring everybody out. Um, but one thing, a writing exercise that I saw in a book, which I posted my dialogue class to our Writing Gals YouTube page, and I have it annotated in there, so you can watch the class and find that. But you write down the personality quirks of your character. So say they are easily annoyed, or they're sarcastic, or say they're timid, or say they are optimistic, all these different things that you figure out for your character. And then you look at their lines of dialogue and you say, okay, how would a person that has this personality type say this? Because people would say things different ways. Like if you ask someone to shut the door, a timid person would say, would you mind maybe shutting the door? And someone who is just used to being in charge and a leader say, hey, shut the door. It changes the actual words that they use to say things and how they interact with each other. And so I think that personality is just super important. Um, there's also all sorts of things that change based on who is the more dominant character in the person in the conversation, what their relationship is, the roles that they play with each other. Because you're going to talk to your boss different than you're going to talk to your child, and so all these things kind of swirl together, and you just have to look at each and not just automatically write the first thing that comes into your head. Step back and say, okay, this isn't me saying this. This is my character saying this. And what would they say?
I also think oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's important too to know backstory about characters. And I'm noticing that in the book I'm writing right now, rule number 3, you can't kiss your best friend. Writing in first person is fun, but when you only write first person, one point of view, it makes it hard to understand and know the motivation of your other characters. Especially for me, it's her best friend. I'm not 100% sure where his character arc is going to go, what he's going to do. And honestly, my last book, I didn't really know it till about 3/4 of the way through, until I figured out exactly what was going to happen the rest of the book. And I think that can really affect your dialogue, because dialogue in a book is not like, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you doing? How was school today? Oh, it was good. That's very boring dialogue. You don't want dialogue like that at all. You want dialogue that does something, that moves the story forward, that plants Easter eggs in your reader's mind to think, oh, I wonder when this is going to come up later. Like in the end of one of my chapters in my book that I just wrote, her best friend, she's like, oh, you love me. And her best friend, not the guy, it's a girl. She's like, yeah, and I'm not the only one. And at the end of the chapter, she's like, what did that mean? So hinting to the fact that, yeah, it's her best friend that likes her, and that everyone seems to kind of have this idea, but no one's actually told her this yet. But it's that type of idea of planting these seeds in your reader's mind and planting these seeds in your character's mind that really motivate it. And everything that the person does from their backstory and their motivation is going to be shown in this dialogue. How they move the conversation, where they change, how they respond to things is really going to be steeped in the dialogue to move the story forward. So someone goes, oh, yeah, I remember them talking something about this or hinting towards something like this in previous chapters, because the author knew this is something that's going to come up in the future. I need to start foreshadowing and laying the groundwork right away. So knowing your backstory, knowing your characters. But I think it's hard. A lot of times people will be like, and I got this advice a lot when I was starting out writing, is, this person doesn't, you need to work on the voice. And I was like, well, what the heck does that mean? That doesn't help me at all. And I think you kind of have to, if you know your character and you're grounded in your character and people tell you that, I don't know. Maybe you guys can help me out with how to explain this, because I think it can really trip up new authors when someone tells them there's something wrong with the voice of your character. And I don't necessarily think that the person who says it really knows the voice of your character. So I don't know if this was a question that you asked, but maybe you guys can help me out.
So sorry if you hear the thunderstorm. Really, it's like crazy. So I actually had this problem with my mermaid book because one of my beta readers sent it back and said, I can't really tell the difference between, all these male voices, like the young 20-something voices in my book. To them, all kind of sounded the same, and it's hard because, kids of a certain age that hang around together a lot tend to kind of talk the same way. I mean, if you get your kids together with their friends and listen, they kind of all pretty much say a lot of the same things. And so it's really, really hard. But I think one of the things that really helps me is to have them say something unusual, every once in a while, like something that's unexpected, like, and not for every character, but if I have two that are sounding a lot alike, then I'll try and do something. Did you guys hear that? Something extra in their dialogue, and something the reader starts to count on, like just throwing odd, funny things out, and it'll start to become part of that character's personality. So maybe you just have to let one of them evolve a little bit more. And funny enough, one of the things that I was thinking about was I was researching locals that lived in this town, Destin, in Florida, and I found all these, like, this whole series of videos about locals that live in Destin made by somebody, and it's that person talking while they're showing all these scenes that they're going about their usual life, and I could hear their voices and the way they talked, and it was really interesting because I realized that I don't talk enough about the pitch of someone's voice. That's a description you can give. That's one of the key things that we listen to in real life is the sound of someone's voice, not just what they say. And in black and white words, so often all you have, is what they're actually saying, or people use a lot of action tags, which we'll talk about in a minute. But think about how their voice sounds. I had I think my first billionaire, Trust of a Billionaire, I gave her a really low pitched voice. So, and I had him comment on it several times about how that was something he found attractive, that he liked the low pitched, quality or tone of her voice. And giving a guy a higher pitch, not probably your love interest, because women tend to really like deep voices in a love interest. So pair him up with somebody like maybe his best friend and talk about how his voice is, higher pitched, or something like that. So just pull in everything you can to try and flesh them out and make them different. I was going to talk. Go ahead.
Adult books, so it's easy to get voices different. My struggle is I'm finding is not falling into the same patterns with YA, because I think they're all pretty similar. So maybe Judy has some ideas on how to keep voices distinct, especially when you're writing, because if you think a YA book, you think high school romance. There's not a lot different in there. So keeping it fresh and new, I think, is really important, especially just in the YA genre, because the options you have to write in aren't as big, because you can't really change their career. You can't really change these other things that are so distinct in adults as they go on. So maybe Judy can impart her knowledge on us.
I don't know if I'm super good at that, because a lot of mine do sound probably really similar. But just kind of showing their personalities, like some of my characters are like a lot more outgoing than others, and so maybe they'll talk more and they might dominate the conversation more than like the shyer characters. And the shy characters will maybe keep their sentences shorter. Like, I don't know if you guys have noticed while watching this, I am probably a little more reserved than these ladies, and I don't talk nearly as much. And so you just kind of do the same thing in your books. Maybe you have them, keep their comments short and sweet and to the point, and then your other ones that are more outgoing, they're good at explaining for a longer period of time. So yeah,
Which can I say, it's really hard to make like a quiet person in a book when you're always hearing their internal thoughts. Have you ever noticed that? Like you feel like someone's chattier than they are if you hear their internal thoughts. I think the only time like making a quiet character work really well is if you're not in their point of view, like ever, which is just some kind of weird thing. But let's talk about slang since we're talking about young adult just a little bit. So slang becomes dated really easy. So what do we do about slang? Because teenagers use slang, and then like the next week it's out. Like
Yeah.
I totally thought you said Spanx. Let's
just
talk about
slang.
Spanx. And I was like, what?
We'll talk about Spanx after the podcast.
Yeah, I just try to avoid slang because, like you said, it'll
It's
disappear
like
in a week, and I want my books to last longer than that.
Yeah, so my daughter was telling me just like a few days ago, one of her friends said a word to me and it just kind of went, she's like, Mom, did you hear what she said to you? And I was like, no, what'd she say? She said that to you. I was like, okay. She's like, Mom, that's like really mean. That's really rude. I had no idea. Like apparently it's like B, like the sound beh. I don't know. Beh. Like, I'm like, what? Okay, it's just like it's just it evolves at a much faster rate than it did when I was a teenager because of phones, because of social media, because of it just is shared so quickly that it evolves on a faster cycle than it ever has before. And so yeah, slang is like so quick to be outdated. So avoid it as much as you can. Which
Or use it and just realize that it's probably gonna go out of style.
Yeah.
And maybe use it in like a nostalgic kind of way, so that it dates it, but dates it in a good way. Like if the person has a parent that's born in the 80s or 90s, not 90s, 60s, 70s, I can count backwards. Then that's probably okay to use the slang back then, because I think enough people know enough about, like if you're like the mom's like, oh yeah, I had a Walkman, then most people are going to know what a Walkman is, hopefully, because it's become, cool to have hair scrunchies and high water pants. And oh my gosh, what I've seen kids wear nowadays, I'm like, this is so the 80s. When did the 80s become the new cool, like retro style?
Or early 90s. I know. Well, see, and that's an interesting point, because some people may want to be okay with their books being dated. Like, this is today, but in 10 years from now, it will be dated. And maybe they're okay. Maybe it's a little time capsule, because I still go back and read earlier books where, they have flip phones, and I'm like, okay, they have flip phones.
Movies where you're like looking at their phone and you're like, oh my gosh, this was cool back then. Like, this was the new, like the hottest technology.
Yeah.
And you're like, not so much anymore.
What movie is it where Tom Cruise pulls out the cell phone and it's like this big?
Like Impossible or something like that.
And it's just like, at the time it was like, whoa, and now it's like, wow, it's so cool. Like, he has this giant. Anyway, but it's the same thing with words, I would say though, try and stay with some of the more classic and more widespread slang rather than these flash in the pan things. You know what I'm saying?
Like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think as well, it can show your character. So my first book, rule number 1, I have her say on God's green earth. And I remember a couple of people, Judy included, saying, I don't think a teenager would say that. But I kind of wanted to show that she was just a little bit different, because she didn't really her dad was really overprotective, and so she spent a lot of time with her dad. So she would pick up a lot on a lot of the things that he did and said that she wouldn't maybe necessarily get with like, yeah, you know, more of the teenage crowd. And but then you like, you know, shift over to like the popular, obviously a, you know, a cliche is a popular teenage mean cheerleader, where her dialogue is going to be much different because she surrounds herself probably more with girls her age, so they're going to be saying different like dialogue. So yeah, you can use it to kind of give an idea of your character if you have them say more of the older slang or anything like that.
Yeah.
And when they do it, just maybe sometimes you want to call attention to it too. Be like, oh, you're so old fashioned or something. Like,
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about using formal words or formal manners of speaking, you generally want to avoid it when writing contemporary works, unless you have a character that would speak formally, or if there's a situation where they would be really formal, like in a courtroom, for example, you know, or a professor at the head of a class. I mean, there's all kinds of places and people where you might still have formal language be the best way to have someone speak. And when we're talking about historical fiction, nothing will drive historical readers crazier than when their speech is too contemporary. You know? And a lot of times people haven't done the research to learn what words were, when words were created or invented. And so like people might be using words that have only existed since the 1970s, you know, because it's something, it's a word, right? It describes a particular thing, but it wasn't a thing back in the 1800s. And so you really have to know your time, and that's just like an extra fun thing with dialogue.
and that's why I write contemporary and nothing else, because I don't know that.
It's like a definite challenge, but you know, it's kind of when you're writing an 80 or a 90-year-old character, they were born, you know, back in the 19, oh gosh, here we go with the math thing, 40s, you know, and so 1940, 1930 to 40, yeah. And so what was speech like when they were a child? Because they would carry a lot of that forward with them. They would. When I listened to my grandmother speak, you know, there's just a few things that are just awesome that she says that, like you said, teenagers wouldn't say, but she would. And so it's just kind of like a fun thing to pull out and show that character's age and background. Okay, let's talk about.
I love showing it in YA when the adult says something that's more contemporary or younger, and then all the teenagers are like, "What the heck did he say? Don't say that word because it sounds awful coming from you," or something like that. That's always fun to throw in there.
Oh my gosh, since I have a 13-year-old daughter, there is nothing my husband and I enjoy more than when she's got friends over and we come in and start using slang with them. And they're like, "No, you've ruined the word forever." It's so fun. That's the best. Okay, we're kind of running out of time just a little bit. There's not a whole lot that we really needed to talk about. I want to talk about cheesy dialogue first and then talk about dialogue tags. So, how do you know if your dialogue is cheesy? How do you know if it sounds good? How do you know if it's working? What are your tips for figuring out if your dialogue stinks?
Reading it out loud helps a lot, and then reading it to other people and they can tell you if it's cheesy. That's what I need, because I am sometimes cheesy. So
yes, it's so easy to do, especially with romance, right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah, the words sound so poetic and romantic in your brain, and then if you start saying them out loud, you're like, whoa, you know, like. So what I do is I have my husband read it to me, because my husband just has this perfect, like, I'm making fun of this voice. So when he reads my dialogue in that voice, I can hear like every cringy syllable of it. And then I think, okay, so that's the worst this is ever going to sound. Now, how do I make it better? You know what I'm saying? But it's just kind of one of those things. It's definitely something you have to hear. Judy's right. I mean, you have to. I mean, sometimes there's a part and you just know it's good. But if you ever come across a little section where something's not feeling right or you're worried about it, definitely read it out loud or have someone else read it out loud to you. And that's kind of a trick in general, is that it helps you to see how someone else interprets it, because we always put our own inflections in the dialogue. We know what we want it to sound like, but what is the reader going to see? Like, where are they going to put the emphasis in the sentence? Where are they going to, what kind of personality are they going to inject into it? And I always think that that's kind of an interesting perspective. So, dialogue tags, unless Amy has something to do with talk about.
I was just going to say, one thing I love to do is to watch movies and study dialogue that way, because in a book, people can be very, very, very long-winded. And if you, in a movie, you have a very, very short period of time, unless you're watching a Transformer movie, which lasts forever, to have dialogue. So you have to be very specific in how you do it, and very to the point with it.
Concise.
Yes, concise. Thank you very much. And you can watch a lot of the romance movies and kind of get a feel for what's cheesy and what's not. And I think a lot of times the things that we think are cheesy really aren't to other people, especially if they're engrossed in the story. But also, if you think it's cheesy, then maybe just change it up. Then you're writing something that you can't really stand behind, so make it different. Don't feel like, oh, I have to write this because this is the only way, especially in romance. You don't really hear people saying, I remember I was reading a book to a beta group and they were like, holy cheesy. And I was like, oh, okay. But then everybody else was like, no, it wasn't cheesy. So I was like, okay, that's good. Know that sometimes some things are going to be cheesy for some people and not for other people. And you can't please them all. So, just be careful on how you write it. But if you, get one person who says it's bad or cheesy, realize that maybe not the entire population feels that way about it.
I was going to say something else. Oh, about editing dialogue. I always try to cut as many words out as I can. So I write it, and we talked a little bit about filler words and stuff like that, but there's more in there than you think there are. Like, sometimes I cut out whole prepositional phrases. I cut out, just all kinds of stuff. And you just want to cut and cut and cut and cut until you just can't cut anymore. We tend, like we've said, to be long-winded as people, and we take a long time to get to our point. I know if I listen to this podcast, I'm gonna be like, see, you're like the perfect example of how to be long-winded and put in a lot of filler words. But when you're editing, cut words out. Try to make it as short as you can, because that's when it gets snappy. That's when it gets interesting. That's when it sparks, and it controls the pacing, like we've talked about. It doesn't do any good to try and use dialogue to move the character through the chapter if they're having to read these really long-winded paragraphs. When people are talking and one of them is going on and on and on and on, the other person usually starts zoning out at a certain point, and they interrupt each other a lot. People interrupt each other a lot, and we want our characters to do what we want them to do and get in and get out. And there's nothing more interesting to a reader than good lines of dialogue, but they have to move fast in most cases. So cut. And always make sure. Someone asked about, they wanted to know what you should talk about, have your characters talk about, because they were an introvert and they didn't know how to have conversations with people easily. Like, they were always wondering, oh, okay, what should I talk about with this person? But in a story with dialogue, it has to have a purpose. I mean, very few conversations need to be without major points. And those conversations, like, even if they're talking about what they like for breakfast or their favorite colors or something, you need to be revealing something about that character. Like, it has to have a point, has to do a job. You can't just, like, So that is kind of freeing, I think, because you don't have to come up with the kind of mindless or, you know, what's the weather like today, or how's the job going? Those kind of awkward social conversations that you can have sometimes. Only use them if you need to show that things are awkward between characters or that they have nothing to say. Do everything with a purpose.
Yeah, I know Victorine says that she, if she doesn't know what the characters should talk about, she'll look up like date conversation ideas and that those are usually really telling and let you really get to know people really well.
So if you do something like that, you have to make sure that you're using it as a moment to reveal character, or backstory, or have it performing a function. So in my mermaid book, there is a scene where I actually had them kind of teasing each other. They didn't know very much about each other, so they started asking the questions, like, what's your favorite color? And he said that she said her favorite color was yellow, and he was kind of like, yellow? She's like, yeah, it's the color of sunshine. And to a girl who's always lived in the water, the sunshine is something that she really, really likes, and so that's why she likes yellow. Where you might think a mermaid might like blue or green or something. Well, his favorite color was blue, and she was like, why would you like blue? He's like, well, it's refreshing, it's cool. And she's like, no, it's cold and dark and endless, because that's what blue meant to her. And that's what's really cool about those conversations, is it's not just, at that point, it's not just cliche or random or pointless. It has a very real effect on those characters and their relationship, and also it reveals a lot about them. Okay, let's talk about dialogue tags, because we are like out of time. I told Judy she was supposed to shut me up tonight, and so far she's just smiling at me. So
you're doing a really good job. So.
Well, thank you. Okay, so dialogue tags. A lot of people hear so many different things about what to do, what not to do. So how do you guys work the dialogue tag thing? Or the action tags, as they're called.
Yeah, I will I'll use action tags a lot if I can, just to kind of show what's going along in the story. But if there's a lot of dialogue going on, the characters don't need to like pour the water into the cup and then take a drink of it, then set it down. You don't have to show every little step that they do. And so if you have to differentiate between which character is saying it, a lot of time just use said. Like, you don't need to say all these other fancy things like he chortled and he chuckled, and so you don't have to use all those little, like, you don't have to be super creative with that. So I know that the English teachers may have taught that to you.
Oh my gosh,
but said is perfectly fine. You want to make the dialogue so that it show, like, you can tell how they said it instead of
or with their actions. So if you go on Pinterest and you look up dialogue tags, you will just find lists and lists made for classrooms, like elementary classrooms, with all the fun words that Judy's talking about. I grew up reading Harlequin romances from like the 50s and 60s, and oh my gosh, they used those a lot. And what's funny is they used he smiled a lot as a dialogue tag. Like, your shoe is untied, he smiled. Like, you don't smile conversation. But when I was reading it, I was like, it didn't even, come out at me that it was like a problem. But now I'm like, yeah, you can't smile words. You can't laugh words. You can't chuckle words. You can laugh and then say words, so it's kind of one of those things. Be careful that if you are using a creative dialogue tag, that it is actually a way to speak. Let's just start right there. But I would use them extremely carefully. If you maybe one or two or three, maybe in a whole book, if you just feel like that spot really, really needs them. I agree with the camp that use he said, she said if you need to specify who's speaking. How do you feel about things, Amy?
I have used dialogue tag of I lied really a lot, especially if it's something my character doesn't normally do, or it's like a something that I'm putting focus on. I know it's not necessarily a dialogue tag, and I don't use like the comma quotation I lied, because obviously that's not. But I use that in terms of I said, just to draw attention to the fact that the character knows that they're lying. And that may be out of character for them. I use he said, I said more than not. I think it's, especially me and Michelle have talked about it in audiobooks. It gets really hard to know who's talking and who's saying what, because you can't visually go back and trace down to be like, okay, they said that, okay, he said that, or she said that, or whatever. Especially if you got multiple people in a conversation, it gets really difficult. So I just throw it in just for the reader's sanity, so they don't actually have to go. I mean, there's been times in a book where I have gone back to look and trace down who was the person who said that. And that shouldn't be what a reader is doing. A reader shouldn't have to like work just because, and I remember seeing a post that someone said, I have 100,000 word book and I don't have said once in it. And I was like, that's a very strange thing to be proud about. I mean, that's great that you were creative enough to figure out ways, but that might be difficult for your reader in the end to really engross themselves into the story, because I said is like a and the. It's something we just pass over. We don't even really like digest it and like think about it, unless we're like, okay, who said that? And then if you just put it there, automatically they'll know, okay, that person said that, and then I'm good to go. So I like to err on the caution of doing it more, but it comes down to reading out loud. If I'm like, oh, I said like 3 times in a row, I should delete 1 or 2 of those and kind of switch it around so that, add the action on there to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I mean, it's not something that you should purposely not do because, oh no, I can't have any dialogue tags, because you're doing your reader a favor by having more than trying to skim and have none.
Yeah. So, like she talked about, we have, in our last podcast, we were talking about audiobooks and how they're getting bigger and bigger, and how you're leaving money on the table in a lot of instances if you're not putting an audiobook out. So you want to think about audiobooks now when you're writing a book, because a narrator is not going to go in and be adding things for you. That's not anything that they're even really allowed to do. And so if you pull off a whole conversation with no dialogue tags, even if you have action tags, even if you're putting in some breaks like he shut the door, well, you're a crummy person, she crossed her legs. I think that you're wrong about that. I'm just making up stupid stuff. So you can put in those action tags that show somebody moving before they speak, so that okay, this person is speaking now. But when you read, those all get jumbled up. Like someone could say something and then shut the door. You don't know that they shut the door and then said something. And so, especially if it's 2 women or 2 men, you can't even tell from the narrator's voice that there's a difference in who's saying the line. So think about that. Someone asked on our Facebook page, how do you know if you're putting too much action into your dialogue? Which is kind of the big trendy thing to do right now, is to use all action to show the change in speaker. And it's kind of like, just like my example, like he folded his arms and said blah blah blah. She tucked some hair behind her ear and said blah 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 blah. It's like if you just constantly like action speak action like all the way through a conversation, it gets really really lame. And
Lays down the scene a lot. Like that's what I did that in my first couple books so much that then I had to just go back and revise and just be like, how many of these things can I take out? What is actually needed here to kind of give an idea of the setting? And it can just really slow down the scene.
You want to avoid what's called the talking head syndrome, where all of a sudden you just have dialogue happening and you're not grounding the reader in the space that they're in. So occasionally put some things in to remind us where they are, but I always say make it count. Like make what they're doing count. if you're gonna show them performing an action, make that action show you emotion, or make it show you, like their dis their discomfort, or that they want to leave, or something about, setting, world building. There's so many things that you can use those things for. So don't just be having your character do something just because you don't want to say he said. Does that make sense? Like, do everything with a purpose. And I also think that dialogue does get better sometimes. You have to monitor the pacing. So sometimes you need to get all that stuff out of the way. And you need to let two characters just go back and forth at each other. And like we've talked about, the he said, she said disappears. And so that's, if you want a rapid paced conversation, that's not the time to be having them moving around and doing things constantly. Or even having internal thoughts a whole lot.
Well, I was going to say, because like in a contemporary romance, there is, in a scene, there's the scene pieces, and then you have the sequel, the stuff that leads it all together. In a romance, it's not so much like we don't have the action, and then we have to take a break to talk about the war we just fought. It's not the same. And I would like to think that in a contemporary romance, a lot of the sequel or the scenes are the dialogue, the conversations that are happening between people. Somebody does something and then they're talking about it. And that's the action most of the time, I think, in a romance. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong.
And so, when they like kiss and hold hands and do all that fun stuff.
Right. But that normally happens like along with the conversation, because you can't just have them kissing. You have to have the buildup of the conversation, the kiss, which lasts a couple paragraphs, and then the talking. So there's more talking than not, than I would say maybe in that talking that is seen in a romance than there is like fighting, which you would have maybe in a fantasy and a sci-fi. So for me, the sequel would be not, you can't just throw action in there. A lot of the sequel in a romance would be between the dialogue, the internal thought, the processing, the sitting back and thinking about and chewing on the words. Obviously, not if you want an action where they're like bickering back and forth and then they're just, because if you try and throw a lot of sequel in there, then people are like, okay, now this fight is dragging, So if you think about a fight you have with your spouse, you're not like, hello, that's me. You're going back and forth, and you're trying to say something, and you wouldn't be sitting there going, okay, now I'm going to sit a moment and think about what you just said. And then I'm going to come back and now we're going to talk about it. Like, you wouldn't do that. But in a lot of the other dialogue, there is that sequel of thinking about it. So if you just have dialogue, action, there's not that sequel in there to kind of give the reader a break from the talking back and forth to kind of interpret what was being said and then moving the conversation forward. Or you can tell me speaking blasphemy and I'll shut up.
So dialogue's like a tower of blocks, I think, sometimes. Like, it builds all the way. Like, one sentence or one thing somebody says leads to, what the next person's going to say, and then they're going to respond. I mean, it's all about response. And so you have to remember that. And that's what kind of makes it difficult to edit, is you're like, wait a second, I need them to say something about this in this conversation. You're like, but where do I put it? Because, I've got my dominoes all laid out here. But the thing is that if you ever make a break in that chain, like with internal thought or actions or something like that, and you have like the last thing somebody said, and then there's the next person's response to it separated by this big chunk, the reader's going to get lost. So many times, and I do this all the time, and my beta readers call me on it, and they're like, what was the question? Like they're lost so easily from here to here. Like, why are they saying that? And I'm like, because they're answering his question. That was like 4 paragraphs up there, remember? And so that's a problem. Like, you have to keep things close together. You have to keep all of that stuff to a minimum. And sometimes you feel like that's the best place to have them think something, but again, do it really fast, really, really short, or,
Well, and sometimes you can also like rephrase the question, like,
you have to
answer a little bit if you have to. Yeah.
Yes, remind the reader where they're at in the conversation. Okay, So we're about out of time, and I think we've been through all of our questions. So do we have anything on the live feed?
So no, we don't have anything, but I did want to take this opportunity to say a giant pet peeve of mine that has to do with dialogue, and that's starting the book with dialogue and then paragraphs and paragraphs of backstory and nothing else having to do with that dialogue. That bothers me so much because dialogue is very snappy and can draw people in. So if you say, I'm gonna die is the first sentence, and then you go on and on about my life and my backstory and all this stuff, now all of a sudden I'm bored because you drew me in with this I'm gonna die dialogue, and then nothing happens after that. So be very careful on how you add dialogue in the beginning of the sentence or the book is hard because your reader does not have that emotional bond with that character yet. So they are not going to feel that intensity that you have. They're going to base it on the words that are being said. And then if you don't have them going somewhere after that or keeping up with that, it will turn your reader off, or you will turn me off as a reader because I can't stand that at all. Because to me, it's kind of a cop-out to put a sentence in there to draw your reader in and then not talk about that sentence for a while because you kind of feel cheated when you read it. So be very careful on how you use dialogue in the beginning of your books.
Well, I think you're especially right, especially if it's not like Amy's right. We don't know who these characters are, and the first line of the book is somebody talking. Dialogue is only effective if we know who is saying it, and we have some kind of understanding of who that character is, and so start to build that relationship a little. There's very, very few times that the dialogue can work well unattributed at the beginning. I think you have to let us know who's saying it at the very, very least. And I would say one of my pet peeves about dialogue is when something is repeated again. Like, you already said that. Why are you saying it again? Like, dialogue is informing the reader. And so if a character is talking to person A and she tells them, this, and that, we don't need her to go to character B and say the same thing. Like, maybe in the story she does, but we as readers don't have to sit there and listen to the conversation over again. Does that drive you guys crazy? Oh my gosh. It makes me insane. I'm like, I don't want to sit through the same conversation again.
See, now I do that when Victorine calls me on all the time, but I have them internally think something and then they ask the question in the dialogue. And it drives me crazy, but sometimes I leave some of them in there because I think, I don't know, I like it there. So I'm like, no, I'm going to keep it there because this is my book.
I can do what I want. Yeah, it did.
I do notice now that she's pointed it out, like why, it loses its impact when you say, when you think it and then have them say it. So normally I try to weed out or phrase it differently or move it forward a little bit. So instead of just saying, why did he do that? Then she'll go and be like, more specific or, did you not think of what would happen if you did that sort of kind of thing where you move it forward. So it's not just them rethinking. But I do that all the time.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that really, really good dialogue writers are able to do is to express things in like one word or like two words, and also to avoid the things like the character saying, I'm angry, or have them think, I'm really mad, and have it all portrayed in like one word or like two words, So think about, read when you're reading books and some like a line that a character says really like punches you hard. And you're like, wow, look at it. Look at why it was effective. Why did that line of dialogue work so well? Because sometimes it's like, a character could say something like perfect, like one word. They could say, I don't know, milk. And you're like, anybody else saying the word milk would not mean anything. But because of the way the author has built this character and because put meaning into one word, if a character says that one word, all of a sudden, like, you're like, oh my gosh, he's so witty. He's so intelligent, And that's what we're all trying to make is these characters that the readers know so well that the dialogue doesn't even have to be like the most witty, wonderful dialogue. It just has to be that person. It has to be what that person would say in that situation. That's when it's really, really good. So, anybody have any recommendations of authors that they like that are really good at dialogue? So I like Lindsay Buroker. I hope I'm saying her name right. My favorite series of hers is The Emperor's Edge, and every single one of her characters has a personality, has a voice. I honestly do not need much in the way of dialogue tags in her stories to know exactly who's talking at any given time. For me, it's like a little master class on dialogue. Georgia Hare, I would have to say the same too. She writes Regency, and she writes the most amazing dialogue ever as well. How about you guys? Do you have any authors you just really like their dialogue for our viewers to check out?
You guys, of course.
Uh,
Well, I loved in Amy's one that's coming out. She talked about the enemies to lovers thing. That they have some really good banter in there. Just so y'all know, so that one's good.
Awesome.
I don't really have any off the top of my head, except for Michelle and Judy both do great dialogue as well. So they've definitely women who have studied, and Victorine, but I'm not going to add her because she's not here tonight. She's traveling in a hotel with us. But, dialogue is something that is perfected over time. So if you feel like you can't write it now, keep trying and keep listening to people when they tell you that they don't feel like something is true to the character or if they think it's long-winded, and then try and pare it down and see if you can make it better, because we're not perfect at it, and we're always going to get better. And each time you write dialogue, you're going to get better at it, and you study dialogue, you're going to get better at it. So that's the takeaway.
When we're critiquing each other, I think we do a great job of helping each other with dialogue and telling each other that was good dialogue. We do tell each other that really well. And I think if you are a writer who's working with other people and critiquing their work, that is a great thing to tell people. Say, this line of dialogue was amazing, or this made me laugh, or, this made me cry. Let them know this is working, because so many times authors will change things in edits. Things will get shifted around, or they won't know it's good and it will get edited out. So let authors know, hey, this is working. It might also help them find their character's voice, and let them know when their character when their character is saying something that person wouldn't say. That's one of the most helpful things that I get back from my beta readers and editors. Is feedback like, this character would not say that. And so often I'm like, oh, they wouldn't say that, And then I go in and rewrite the dialogue, and it just turns out amazing compared to what I started with. And it's because they pushed me on it and called me on it. So do that for your writer friends.
Well, and I think too, also not just saying it's not working for you, but giving them examples of why you think it's not, or tell them why. Like I always think he would say this instead, because sometimes the worst feedback I think you can give is being like, I don't like that, or that voice is weird, or he wouldn't say that. You know what I mean? Like, 'cause sometimes you're like, well, obviously he said it because he said it in my mind when I was watching it in my head before I was writing it. I don't know how you guys write your stories, but that's how I do it. So I'm like, so some insight into why it is that you feel like he wouldn't say that would be good. So, sometimes hints or helpful hints like that, or just, and people are like, well, I feel like I'm rewriting their story. And I'm like, no, you're not necessarily rewriting that. You're just saying, I feel like they would say, this instead of that. And that way the person goes, okay, either two things are wrong here. One, I wrote the dialogue wrong, or two, I totally portrayed this character wrong because he would not say what you thought he would say. So I need to go back and change some things. Yeah. So I think that is really much more helpful than just saying it's not working for me.
Yeah. So many times I think my feedback has been something like they'll correct the dialogue or have actually write their line of dialogue. And for me, I just kind of like, what do you think you are? This is not your story. Why are you putting words in my character's mouth? No. and I just think, okay, so what are they trying to say? What are they trying to lead me to? And so I'll go that. The best way they give me that same feedback is, well, like there's an example in my dialogue class, where I had an older lady who was really feisty and just said like blunt things and all this sort of stuff. And then she's saying, if you'll take advice from an old wise woman, blah 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 blah. And they're like, Michelle, that is not this character. I'm like, you're right. That she would just like go in guns blazing and just tell them what it is, tell them how it is. And so I changed. It was a change in personality in what she said, and it made all the difference. And so sometimes it's just like you lost their personality, or their personality has seemed to be this, and this dialogue makes them sound like this. That's really, really helpful to me, because then I can go in and say, you're right. That personality quirk of theirs or whatever would lead them to say this. So that's really helpful to me. So any final thoughts, or should we wrap up and let people get off here and go write some awesome dialogue? I think so. So we really enjoyed having you guys on our show tonight, and we hope that you will check out the dialogue class that I have also posted on our Writing Gals website. And we hope you come back next week, because we're going to have another Q&A session, and we're going to ask for questions about launches, how to launch. We keep learning and growing. All of us are trying different things all the time. And so we want to revisit launch strategy with a Q&A panel. Sound good, everybody? All right. Thanks for staying up late with us, guys. Have a great writing week. Bye.